We've got Gordon, Ian, and Kelly to present for us on the annual allowable cut, the AAC. This is a conversation that I've heard a lot ever since I've moved to the boundary. Everybody's talking about the AAC, and I am just so grateful for the three of you to join us today at the Advisory Council meeting. So thank you very much. Ian is a stewardship officer. I believe you're all working just for the Selkirk Region District. I'm sort of looking over at you here.
No, we have.
I know Ian is. So Ian is with a stewardship officer with the Selkirk Resource District. Gordon Nienaber, sorry, yep. Gordon
that's
is
perfect.
a senior in analysis with the timber supply analysis. So, and Kelly Izzard, timber supply geomatics forester. It's my pleasure to have you all here, and thank you very much. I know that I've learned a lot through our conversations already coming to setting up for this presentation, and I look forward to hearing the information plots. I will pass it over to the three of you. Thank you very much.
Morning. So I said Gordon Nienaber. I'm senior analyst overseeing the TSAs and for forest analysis and inventory branch, and we're a branch working under the office of the chief forester. And I'm going to lead out here, giving a little background on the timber supply review process. I can give a bit of background. I'm still working from home here. I'm calling in from Gabriola Island, where things in the garden are starting to bud and bloom. But I'm working out of the Nanaimo regional office. Starting next week, we'll be back at it. Excellent. Okay, so I made up a presentation here. It's usually our TSR background one, but I've customized it for the boundary TSA. And so we can hop over to the first slide. So the timber supply review process is designed to provide the chief forester with information needed to make the allowable annual cut determination. I always remember the acronym that it's alphabetical order and get that straight. The AAC determinations are stewardship and sustainability decisions, and they identify the information gaps and areas of uncertainty to set priorities for data collection and research. So the whole process is to come up with one number. That's the whole focus of the decision part, but also as a byproduct of it, we get a better idea of the data that's out there and some of the risks and uncertainties in that data. And that sets direction for the time after the AAC is set. We can improve on that data and implement research. Next slide. So our whole reason for being came about because of Section 8 of the Forest Act. And these few lines here lay out exactly what our job is as the analyst supporting the chief forester, because it states that the chief forester must determine the AAC at least once every 10 years after the date of the last determination. And it applies for the Crown land in each timber supply area, but only to the area outside of tree farm licenses, community CFAs, First Nations woodland license areas, and woodlots. All of those areas have their own separate process for setting their rate of harvest. And then also out of our team, we also oversee the review of the AACs being set for the tree farm licenses. But they are also done independently. Next slide. So Section 8 goes on in great detail and lists all of the things that the chief forester must put her mind to as she goes through this process. And this kind of acts as the skeleton for our process, that we go through and check each of these off as we go through the steps and make sure this information is ready and available for the chief to put her mind to. But each one of these factors can be broken down into multiple sub-factors as well. So it's a lot of information. I won't go through all of it here. But the important part is at the end, she also has to consider the social and economic objectives as expressed by the minister. And we'll get into that detail later. So next slide, yeah. So the chief forester's job is to set the maximum volume available for harvest. And she does this as an independent statutory decision maker. So this is a pretty special role in that she's separate and independent from the ministry structure itself. And the unique role of chief forester has maintained throughout the years. And she's very proud of that independence. And it says in her role that she must not be fettered or allow themselves to become fettered by anyone. So she trusts the staff to collect the information and we can put it in front of her, but ultimately it's hers to decide and we can't sway her one way or the other. She must not exceed the scope of authority provided in legislation. So she can't establish or change land use objectives, ownership, or legislation. She can't authorize operational activities or projects and cannot apportion the AAC. So it's not, the AAC is not a tool to affect change in management in the land base. It's simply there as a threshold for sustainability. And most importantly, the apportionment of the AAC, once she sets the number, how it gets divvied up subsequently is done by the minister and is part of the government structure and outside of her role. So she does not get swayed about how that volume will get used once it's set. Next slide. At the beginning of every rationale that she publishes her decision in a document, the AAC rationale, it outlines the guiding principles that she follows when making these decisions. And these are really important because they set out the boundaries in the process that she goes through. And in these guiding principles, we emphasize that her decision is a professional judgment. It's not a calculation, even though very, very detailed data and analysis goes into supporting it. It's still not done as a calculation to a decimal place. She still has ability to adjust numbers up and down as she makes her decision based on the information she has and uncertainties. The AAC should reflect current practice. As I said, it's not intended to drive management objectives, and it's also not forward thinking in terms of changing practices. It looks at the current practice now and projects that forward. So that's why we use the term projection and not forecast. She's not guessing the future. It's taking what we see now and saying, if we keep doing what we're doing, here's what will happen in the future. Risk is assessed and minimized when considering the uncertain data. So of course, at the landscape level and when you're trying to quantify nature, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in that monumental challenge. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about that uncertainty and trying to minimize it where possible. When we run into that uncertainty, we still must proceed in setting these decisions. We can't wait for better and newer information. So what we are comforted by is the fact that we must return to the decisions frequently with newer and better knowledge, and that we'll always update them as time goes on. The AAC determination can't account for speculation on the outcome of land use decisions, etc. There, I was getting ahead of myself, but that's exactly it, because there's always newer and better information coming, and we can't stop and wait and risk the stewardship, especially when AACs have to come down. We can't wait for that better information. But there's always the provision that if major changes happen in the time between AAC determinations that do risk stewardship, that the chief forester can come back and revisit the AAC ahead of the 10-year deadline. So the next slide. So the timber supply review process goes through 5 discrete steps here. And the first step is that we draft a data package, and then that is sent out and shared with First Nations and the public for review. I'll describe each one of these steps in more detail further along. And then we run the timber supply analysis based off of that and publish the results in a public discussion paper, which also goes out for public review and First Nations consultation. And then all of those documents are compiled together along with the information we collected from the public review and consultation, and is considered by the Chief Forester in the context of current legislation. And as I said, those social and economic objectives of the Crown that are shared by the minister. And then from that, she completes her decision and releases it in a written rationale supporting her decision. So the next slide, we'll talk about the data package. So the data package describes the information and assumptions proposed for use in the timber supply analysis. These reflect as closely as possible the current legal requirements and demonstrated current forest management. And so all of these inputs, in theory, we try and be meticulous in documenting it, but we also have a technical documentation we can share. But the idea is that we write down all the assumptions that would go into recreating the same analysis. So it's open and transparent and can be verified by subsequent analysis. This goes out for consultation with First Nations and the public as the draft data package. So nothing is finalized until we share it and hear back from the public. All right, thanks. So throughout this, the data package is the very dry one and very detailed. It goes through the current management considerations, has a discussion of the tools that we use for doing the analysis, the forest estate modeling that Kelly will get into a little more further along, as well as inventories that are the foundation of our understanding of the forest landscape. We go through a detailed process of classifying the land base to see what's contributed and what areas are able to support harvesting and which are encumbered by various legislation. And then the current forest management assumptions and how harvesting is being done, what's economic, what's operable, etc. Another big driving factor for the temporal factor is the growth in yield, how the stands are growing over time, and then all other associated analysis and reporting and information sources. So we're working on putting that together in early stages right now for Boundary TSA. Once it's all done and Kelly has run the analysis and summarized it all, we publish a document that is intended to be a lot more publicly accessible and understandable in terms, and far more interesting in that it has the results of the analysis that everyone's excited to see. It provides the results of that land-based classification and net down, a base case harvest projection, which I'll talk about in the next slide, and the results of key sensitivity analyses. So those are the analyses that are done to explore the uncertainty around various factors in the analysis. So core to the public discussion paper is our timber supply analysis base case, and it's also core to the decision support material that we provide the Chief Forester. It's our reference projection that, as I said earlier, shows if, based on current management and data and legislation right now, if we keep seeing what we're seeing going on now and project that into the future, this is what we could potentially see. It uses the best available information and assumptions that reflect the current legal requirements and demonstrated management practices. I put in the graph from the last TSR for Boundary here. The base case is not an AAC recommendation, but rather one of many sources of information the Chief Forester will consider when setting the AAC. So we put this forth as a reference point, but as I said, she, through the course of her decision and consideration of all the material, can make adjustments upward or downward from this reference. So there's no expectation that this is what the decision will be. going into her determination. Next slide. Information gathered through TSR is presented to the Chief Forester at a meeting that's grown over the years as things become more and more complicated. So now we average about 2 days for these meetings because there's just so much to go through. And this is the meeting that's attended by FABE, district and regional staff. And we go through that Forest Act, Section 8, step by step, so that we can say in her rationale that she has done each one of those considerations that's required by law. The information presented and nature of discussion is confidential at these meetings. And the determination may include an overview flight of the land base so that the chief gets to know the land that she's working and deciding on. We now have meetings with First Nations to hear their interests and that the AAC may impact. And meeting with licensees and other key stakeholders are also offered. All of this is usually done before the meeting so that she has a greater context going into the meeting before considering all that information. Next. And finally, it all culminates in the publishing of the AAC rationale. This is the legal document supporting her decision. It states the AAC and the applicable dates that it's effective. You can see the last one was May 22nd, 2014. So we still have 2 more years until 2024. Provides a detailed record of the Chief Forester's reasoning and includes a comprehensive accounting of each relevant factor that set her and supported her decision. Also throughout it, she describes the uncertainties, risks, and the potential impacts of these risks and identifies where new or better information is needed. She also hears if there's information from the public or First Nations that is not quite applicable to the decision itself of setting the AAC. She'll very often note this and direct it to the structure of the ministry where they can make those changes or address those interests. And so you'll see that very often that she'll say, I can't make this change in management, or it's not in my power to do that, but I will notify those that could work with you to, and the process, where the processes are to affect those changes. And I think that's my last slide. So that summarizes the TSR overall. Thanks.
I think I'm next here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ian Wiles. I'm the Stewardship Officer for the Selkirk Resource District. I'm located in Nelson, and my team is heavily involved these days with timber supply reviews. We have a number of them on the go in the district, and other things we're responsible for is reviewing and approving forest stewardship plans, the forest health program, forest and range evaluation program, and other things, but those are kind of the key components of our job at this time anyway, and it varies a little bit depending on when forest stewardship plans are coming up and when timber supply reviews are due. So I've got a short presentation on TFL 8, and I'll just share it here. So Tree Farm License 8 had the determination on the AAC here just in February of this year. So February 10th was when the rationale and determination was made. For those of you that may not be familiar, TFL 8 is composed of 2 distinct areas. It's got a southern block here, just near Greenwood, which is composed primarily of Boundary Creek and some of its associated drainages here, as well as up near Beaverdale, and this is Carmi Creek here and the headwaters of the West Kettle River. And so this is area-based tenure, and Nienaber has the exclusive rights to harvest timber within this area. So a few facts. So the total area is is 77,189 hectares with a timber harvesting land base of almost 54,000 hectares. I'm just going to move my, sorry about that. Okay, so the timber harvesting land base is an area where harvesting actually can take place. So we subtract any private land or parks that may be within the area where harvesting can take place, as well as non-productive areas. And there's also a number of different areas that are also removed for various management reasons. So there may be wildlife tree, or there are wildlife tree retention areas for every cut block and cutting permit, old growth management areas, unstable terrain, wildlife habitat areas, First Nations considerations, and others as well, such as riparian reserves. So these are areas where other values have been recognized and are removed from the area where harvesting can be calculated for. So a bit of history. The TFL was originally composed of just one block that was established in 1951. The North Block was added in 1967. And so their combined AAC at that time was 141,000 cubic meters. There's been several increases and decreases over time. The largest being in 1987, when there was a mountain pine beetle outbreak, to a little over 300,000 cubic meters. And so the last decision before the one we're talking about today was made in 2009, and it had an AAC of 186,000 cubic meters. So the current AAC decision has been reduced down to 158,000 cubic meters. So that's a reduction of almost 28,000 cubic meters, or 15%. So fairly substantial, I would say. It also has been partitioned so that slopes greater than 45% have a requirement to have a certain amount of cut, and I'll get into that in a few more slides there. So anything you see today in this presentation is all it's from the rationale, the Chief Forester's rationale. So there's more details on all of the points within it, and this is the website where you can see that. It's publicly available, and so if you want more details and information to dig into this more, that's where you can find that. So the base case, Gordon talked a little bit about base case in his presentation, and so the base case is kind of designed to reflect the current management practices and land base that's taking place, or that's being used at the time. Tries to avoid large or abrupt disruptions in timber supply during transitions from short to midterm to long term. It's based on a 300-year time frame, and is trying to ensure a non-declining growing stock during the last 50 years of the projection. So the base case was at 170,000 cubic meters. Now that's not really important overall. The main thing is the new AAC, but that's a bit of background information there. So some of the changes to management and assumptions and modeling, as Gordon said, things change over time. There's new ways of doing things and new improvements to the model, and obviously changes on the land base and the way things are managed as well. So additional reductions have been made to the timber harvesting land base based on First Nations interests and conversations Interfor had with them. I will get into that slightly more as well in a slide coming up here. The old growth management areas have been spatialized, so that's different from the previous one. Those were established in 2007, and so are relatively new at that time. Since the last determination, additional wildlife habitat areas have been established, primarily for sapsucker and a little bit for badger. So that is going to reduce the land base as well, where harvesting can take place, and that's been done by 473 hectares. There's been changes to how the wildlife tree retention is modeled, how roads, trails, and landings have been modeled, as well as the forest inventory. So that's the forested stands that are considered in the model. Those change over time, and so those have been projected to January of 2020. There's been some increases to allowances for non-recoverable losses, additional areas of not satisfactorily restocked areas have been included, some revised regeneration assumptions, and revised modeling in terms of how visual quality areas with visual quality objectives have been modeled. And so, you know, folks may be familiar with visual quality. Some areas have been labeled as retention, partial retention, modification, or max modification. And so each of those areas is modeled differently because they have different requirements into how much or how timber can be harvested on those areas, as well as some updates to stand yield tables for natural and managed stands. So those are some of the differences, and as Gordon said, every AAC is going to have differences and improvements. So some of the factors that have resulted in the reduction to the AAC. So it was noted that there are some areas of backlog that hasn't been satisfactorily restocked to date. So that has contributed about a 1% decrease in the AAC. 130 hectares of mature stands that have been impacted by drought. And so that contributed a small percentage of decrease as well. So there should be a minus sign there. Sorry. Some natural disturbances on the non-timber harvesting land base. So, you know, areas that can't be harvested that are outside the timber harvesting land base still contribute to things like biodiversity, visuals. And so if they are impacted, then that does impact how things can be managed on the harvestable land base. Ungulate winter range for mule deer, the way that was modeled, so resulted in a 1.5% reduction, and a reduction to account for accumulated volume or unharvested volume. So Nienaber has a 5-year cut control period where they're permitted to harvest a certain amount, which we're talking about today. And if they do not harvest that amount over a 5-year period, then it kind of gets set to the side. They're not able to harvest it, and then the ministry has a decision to make onto how to either dispose of that volume or just maintain it and not have that disposed of. There are also some other things that were determined to have unquantifiable amounts. One is cut block size, and the other was silviculture systems. So cut block size, the way the model does it, may not necessarily reflect how things are done on the ground. That's a bit of a shortcoming there, as well as silviculture systems and its ability to harvest partial harvest systems. So those are the main factors that have led to the decrease in the AAC for the tree farm license. As I mentioned here, First Nations, so Nienaber has been working more closely with some of the First Nations on what they're doing regarding riparian management. And so they have made some changes to their practices, and that's reflected in this AAC decision where they have enhanced retention along riparian areas. And so you can see here, approximately additional 2,700 hectares has been removed for riparian buffers, 540 hectares, spatial riparian buffers. So those are areas that can't be mapped. So if, you know, a lot of riparian areas for streams and wetlands, for example, they have defined reserve zones in the FSP and to the amount of area that is to be retained. And there's also a management zone outside of that where a different percentage of retention can be maintained, which was there to essentially protect the reserve zone and enhance its ability to do the things it does to ensure that streams are functioning. And another 643 hectares for Indigenous cultural reasons. So overall, almost 4,000 hectares of the THLB. If you look back, you know, originally the TFL, you know, the outer boundary is 77,000, and now it's been brought down to, I think it was, I'll just scroll back real quick, 53,000 hectares. So that's one of the reasons that has reduced that. The cut, as I mentioned, has also been partitioned. So the performance on steep slope areas is below the, or has been below the proportion of the timber harvesting land base that is steep slope, and below the proportional contribution of these slopes to the base case projections. So for that reason, the AC is essentially broken into two parts. 131,500 cubic meters can be harvested on slopes less than 45%, and then 26,900 cubic meters can come from slopes greater than 45%. So that's certainly a change. In the past, that wasn't the case, and it is something that has been happening, you know, throughout the province in some circumstances where it's warranted. So the Chief Forester, you'll see in her rationale towards the end, has some implementation instructions, a whole host of them for various factors where she wants to see some improvements. And so you can look at those. One that relates to this partitioning is about expecting the license holder to conduct up-to-date watershed and terrain assessments on steep slopes and ensure progress is being made towards a harvest distribution that better represents the profile of the timber harvesting land base. So she expects us to be monitoring that as well, and report out on that performance for the next timber supply review. Okay, this group is about watersheds and concerns for the Kettle River there. So I've added a couple of parts that I thought would be of interest to you. And again, this is in the rationale as well, and some of the considerations that were made for watersheds. So certainly there's been lots of concerns expressed from First Nations groups like yourselves and members of the public over the last number of years, particularly since the flooding a few years ago. And so this was done as an assessment to kind of check on the impacts of potential changes to management due to watersheds. And so what was done was a sensitivity analysis. So this is just a assessment to say, okay, well, if there is a certain factor that may or may not be limiting, how does that, if that changes, how would that affect the AAC? Hopefully that explains things clearly, but it's just with all things being the same, if we change one factor, what is its impact alone on the overall AAC? So those are sensitivity analysis. So one was done on equivalent clear cut area. So that's an area, you imagine it's forested and then harvested and replanted. You know, there's science behind the impact that has on hydrology. So ECA is only one of the factors, though, that goes into watershed. Other ones, for example, are, you know, if an area is harvested, depending on the aspect and the slope, it's going to have different implications potentially, but that has not been included in the sensitivity there. So an ECA level above 30% is commonly considered a bit of a threshold that often indicates a need for a company to investigate further, perhaps have a hydrologist or a specialist do some more assessments to see if that's appropriate or not. And sometimes it is, and it's not an issue, and then sometimes it's not. So again, it's going to be based on a whole host of factors, depending on the watershed being assessed. So that being said, a sensitivity was done, which limited the ECA to watersheds to 30%. That does result in a short-term harvest level being reduced by 4.3%, lower than the base case, but no reduction in the long term. Again, we're talking about a 300-year time frame. The second scenario limited ECA to 40%, so a higher amount, and harvest levels in this scenario stayed the same. So there was no impact on the timber supply there. So some of you may be familiar with some reports that have been done in the last few years. There, Natasha Newman was responsible for the second one here. I believe she may have talked to your group about that in the past. So this is the Kootenay Boundary Regional Cumulative Effects Report. And so information in that was summarized and presented to the Chief Forester, as well as a Forest and Range Evaluation Program report that was done a year or two before Natasha's report as well, which used the FREP riparian process and tried to expand it to a watershed scale to look at a few different watersheds in the Selkirk district, and in this case, Boundary Watershed was assessed. So information from those reports, if you're familiar with them, they were again, information was summarized and presented to the Chief Forester so she could consider them in her decision-making process. So some of the additional outcomes. So the Chief Forester has instructed Interfor to consider the recommendation of these reports and incorporate them into their decision-making processes. And Interfor has said they'll be conducting a watershed assessment on Boundary Creek itself. I'm not sure where that's at. I know they come to these meetings occasionally. Perhaps they can provide some feedback at some point in time on that project. And also for the ministry staff and licensees to work collaboratively with First Nations to implement management objectives to better protect and rehabilitate watersheds. So a few instructions, both for the ministry and licensees, or the licensee moving forward here. Climate change is another one that I know has been a concern raised by folks on the group here, and certainly is something that is being incorporated in the timber supply reviews and certainly evolving over time, and a lot of work being done on making improvements from that perspective. So we know that there are going to be changes in precipitation and temperatures and frequency of disturbance and all those types of things, and so those are mentioned and recognized by the Chief Forester here. There's climate change is talked about in a couple of sections in the rationale under her guiding principles, and as well as in her a section more specific on management for climate change there. So there is a few pages of information dedicated to climate change in her rationale. We know about the changes that are likely, but the magnitude and extent and timing of those impacts are less certain, and so that's what makes climate change more difficult to assess. And so we know that forest management practices need to adapt and change to climate change as well. And so certainly some things are happening already in terms of silviculture and stalking standards, and what trees are planted where, and that sort of thing has been ongoing for a number of years, and certainly gets updated with better information for various areas throughout our district anyway. What else do we have here? This talks about, the last bullet here essentially summarizes how she treated climate change in this decision. So I consider available information on the climate trends, potential impacts to forest ecosystems and communities that depend on forests and related values, and potential management responses. As research provides more definitive information on climate change and its effects, I will incorporate new information in future AAC determinations. Where forest practices are implemented to mitigate or adapt to potential effects of climate change on forest resources, or where monitoring information indicates definite trends in forest growth and other dynamics, I will consider that information in my determinations. So that being said, there were several sensitivities made. Before I get to that, again, some other reports that have been created and conducted that were summarized for the Chief Forester and her decision. So we have a climate change report that was created back in 2016 by our regional ecologist in terms of adapting natural resource management to climate change in the Kootenay boundary. And it does touch on different areas of the Kootenays, and with the boundary being one of them as well. For the TSR process, some modeling was done by one of our, I don't know her exact title, but climate change scientist within the ministry, which summarized the current and future climate change scenarios or expectations that are going to be taking place within TFLA specifically. So the base case does not include any analysis specific to climate change. You know, the information I've talked about are certainly considerations and information that's been made available to her, and she's thought about in her decision-making process, but there hasn't been a specific line item or factor for climate change that says, oh, we've reduced the AAC for by 5% or 10% due to climate change impacts specifically. So sensitivity analysis was done. However, again, how would things be different if one of these factors changed? And so we know climate change can have an impact on the way trees grow. And so sensitivity was done on the assumptions both on natural and managed stands. So if the stands were to increase or decrease by 10%, so that was again a sensitivity there to see how the timber supplier would respond to that, because that's a critical input into the AAC determination. And so if you increase, so for the natural stands, the stands that have not been harvested and replanted, if 10% is increased, it results in a short-term, short and midterm harvest level increase of 6.9%. And if it's decreased by 10%, then that results in a 6.3% decrease in the AAC. And in the long term, the harvest levels are unchanged. And we go to managed stands, so stands that have been harvested and replanted and potentially have other actions taken on them, from brushing to spacing and those sort of things. If we increase or decrease the output of those stands by 10%, the result is roughly the same, where if you're increasing the volume by 10.2% that comes off a managed stand, then you're getting, by 10%, then you're getting an increase by 10.2%. So roughly corresponds there. And although the information I have here may be a bit conflicting, just let me read this real quick. Sorry about that. So the long-term harvest levels stay the same. The short-term harvest levels will change there. So if you have a increasing yield of 10% on a managed stand, in the short term, that will result in a 3.8% increase in what could be available for the AAC. And conversely, if you decrease the yield by 10%, then you would decrease the AAC by 2.6% in the short and midterm. But in the long term, things would remain at about 10%. Hopefully that makes sense there. Again, it is explained in more detail and likely more succinctly than I've just done it. So for climate change, again, implementation instruction there from the Chief Forester. I expect the license holder to complete carbon modeling or climate vulnerability assessment before the next TSR, as well as initiate a young stand monitoring program to monitor managed stand yield assumptions over time. So carbon modeling is a relatively new process that's being incorporated into TSRs, and I think Kelly will explain it a little bit more in his presentation next. So that's all I have today on the rationale for the decision. At the end of the day, the AAC has been reduced by 15%, and hopefully that helps clarify a few things, and certainly I'm available for questions here when Christina has our question and answer period. Thanks.
Howdy all. My name's Kelly Izzard. I am calling to you from sunny Fort St. James, where it's a balmy 3 degrees today. I'll be the timber supply analyst for the Boundary TSR. A bit about me. I've been in the Forest Service since 1994 and have worked as a timber supply analyst with Forest Analysis and Inventory branch since around 2008. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the review that we're undertaking for Boundary. I'll give you a history of the Annual Allowable Cut, or I'll refer to it as the AAC in the unit. Timelines for the review, some of the major themes we'll be exploring. Then we'll open the floor for some questions about any of the presentations you've heard so far this morning. Okay. So this slide details the history of the AAC for the unit. You saw the chart previously in Gord's presentation. The chart on the upper right side are harvest forecasts from previous reviews, with the red line, the base case for 2002 review, and the blue line, the model base case for the 2012 review. The chart on the bottom right shows the scaled harvest from 1995 to 2020. So from 1982 to 1993, the AAC for the Boundary TSA was 700,000 cubic meters a year. In response to a mountain pine beetle outbreak in 1993, the AAC was temporarily increased to 900,000 a year. Then in March of 1995, the AAC was again decreased to 700,000 cubic meters a year, where it has remained stable for most of the recent period. And then in the decision in May of 2014, it was maintained at the level of 700,000 cubic meters a year. Finally, in February of 2015, the West Boundary Community Forest was established, and that reduced the AAC for the rest of the unit to its current level, which is 670,142 cubic meters a year. So this Gantt chart details the various steps and milestones for the review. The major milestones are highlighted in blue. We kicked off the review in the winter of 2021, though we started some preliminary work earlier in the fall. We're currently in the data development phase, and we anticipate having a data package in the fall of this year. We're targeting the publishing of the public discussion paper, or PDP, in the summer of 2023, and working towards a decision in the spring of 2024. Concurrently, we're engaging with First Nations whose traditional territories overlap the unit, and that's depicted in the green area at the bottom of the Gantt chart. Our hope there is that we develop collaborative processes with the nations where we assess potential impacts to rights and title stemming from an AAC decision. And that's ongoing work. Here are some of the major issues and themes we'll be exploring during the review. I'll just touch on a few. Perhaps the biggest issue for the review will be the use of a brand new LiDAR-based predictive forest inventory, or PFI, with new yield estimates. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with LiDAR, the phrase stands for light detection and ranging, and it's a remote sensing method that uses light in the form of pulsed lasers to measure ranges, which are variable distances to the Earth. It's these light pulses combined with other data recorded by an airborne system that generates a precise three-dimensional information about the shape of the Earth and its surface characteristics, including forest characteristics. So that's what's exciting here. this will be the first predictive forest inventory in the province. We'll also be working more fully to integrate the cumulative effects frameworks and values into the review. And for this review, we'll be focusing on 3 of the provincial values: aquatic ecosystems, grizzly, and landscape biodiversity. And we'll also be broadening the discussion on the potential impacts of climate change on timber supply. And I'll touch on these elements in a bit more detail in the following slides. So as mentioned, we'll be utilizing a brand new inventory featuring a new approach to building inventories, and that's the LiDAR-based predictive forest inventory. The LiDAR-based forest inventory is superior to the traditional photo interpretation-based inventories in that it's spatially more precise, objective, quantitative, and it produces estimated error rates for validation. This LiDAR-based forest inventory for the boundary TSA will generate an information-rich inventory product, which likely will be a significant departure from the current, much older VRI-based inventory. So in the end, this will provide us with an opportunity to essentially clear the slate with a new starting point for timber supply review. And that's what makes it exciting. We're currently in the final phase of development of the inventory. We're in our quality assurance phase, and we anticipate having the new inventory available to us for timber supply modeling and the associated yield estimates by the end of the spring of this year. Another theme for the review will be the deeper integration of the cumulative effects frameworks and protocols. As I said earlier, we'll be looking at grizzly bear, forest landscape biodiversity, and aquatic ecosystem health. We've developed a process through the Mackenzie TSR, which is currently underway, where we're assessing trends in core indicators over time for various harvest scenarios. And we'll be doing something similar for that for the boundary TSR with the guidance of the regional hydrologists. The core indicators for aquatic ecosystem assessment that we'll be looking at are listed down on the bottom left there, and those values we'll be looking at trends associated with road density near streams, road density on unstable slopes, stream crossing densities, riparian disturbance, and of course peak flow. So we'll be taking a deeper dive into those issues as part of the review. Another major theme for the review is climate change. And here we'll be exploring some new tools and approaches. We've developed a unit-specific climate change synopsis, which is now a standard feature for all reviews, and it'll be published in the data package. We've replaced the older approach of implementing non-recoverable losses with a new natural disturbance focus that allows us to model disturbance regimes like fire explicitly. This also allows us to explore potential impacts of climate change by modifying disturbance regimes through sensitivity analysis. We're using a tranche approach to illustrating risk within a harvest projection within the base case. The term tranche is borrowed from the investment community, and it refers to an investment portfolio consisting of risk layers or tranches. And for timber supply sensitivity, it refers to the categorization of supply based on risk. The chart on the right categorizes the Mackenzie TSR base case associated with changing the risk associated with changing drought conditions due to climate change. it's a way of visualizing the vulnerability of the projected supply to drought-induced or related mortality, and we'll be doing something similar to that for the boundary TSR. And finally, as Ian mentioned earlier, we'll also be doing carbon modeling associated with the base case and alternative flows and looking at carbon stock based on those harvest projections. So a much deeper dive into climate change as well. So where do we go from here? Our quality assurance on the inventory, that work should be completed this spring, after which time we'll be doing some data development and summarizing that in a data package, which we're anticipating to release this fall. That'll be followed by model development with a base case developed sometime early in the spring of the following year, or 2023, after which we'll be publishing a public discussion paper summer of next year, determination meeting sometime in the fall of next year, followed by a decision in the spring of 2024. And during this period of time, we'll be doing ongoing impact assessments in collaboration and engagement with First Nations, and looking at the potential impacts to rights and title, and developing alternative flows with them. So with that, that's a brief overview of what will become the Boundary Timber Supply Review. And I'm going to, with that, open the floor to any questions that you may have on any of the presentations that you've heard today.